an original MCM production.
Now we're right on schedule to start have Dave McClurg up here to introduce our program. Dave is a shareholder at Petrie and Stocking. Dave?
Thank you, President Dan. It's my privilege today to introduce Geneive Abdo. Ms. Abdo is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Rafik Hariri Center for the Middle East, and has previously been a fellow in the Middle East programs at both the Stimson Center and the Brookings Institution. She's consistently focused on issues regarding modern Iran and political Islam. Ms. Abdo was formerly the liaison officer for the Alliance of Civilizations, a UN initiative which aims to improve relations between Islamic and Western societies. Before joining the United Nations, she enjoyed a 20-year career as a foreign correspondent, focusing on coverage of the Middle East and the Muslim world. From 1998 to 2001, Ms. Abdo was the Iran correspondent for The Guardian, and also a contributor to The Economist and the International Herald Tribune. She was the first American journalist to be based in Iran following the 1979 Islamic Revolution. Ms. Abdo is a prolific author and is currently working on her fourth book, which focuses on the Shia-Sunni conflict in the aftermath of the Arab Uprising. I believe you have some information about that upcoming book on your tables. She's a regular speaker at universities, think tanks, and other institutions in the United States, Europe, and the Middle East. Her visit with us today is sponsored by the A.D. Robertson Fund of the United Nations, a special fund within the RCM Community Trust established to provide educational programming about humanitarian and peace-building work of the United Nations and other international affairs. The fund was created by the family of past President Robbie Robertson to honor his service and commitment to world peace. Please join me in giving Geneive Abdo a warm Rotary welcome.
Good afternoon. It's a great honor to be here, and I'm very pleased the Rotary Club invited me. A special thanks also to Mary McCormick, who found me and invited me here, and it's my first trip to Milwaukee. Sort of serendipitous that I should happen to speak here on this day. I was a little worried about it, but as Dan mentioned, at least you're not a politician. So I hope that you're suffering from American politics disease and you're ready to hear about a new topic. I thank you very much for the kind and a very extensive introduction. I'm going to speak today about one outcome of the Arab Uprisings because I think that it has dominated the news for so many years, and most people do not really understand the basis of this conflict. Even people in the US government do not understand the basis of this conflict, I can tell you from living in Washington. And that is a conflict that has emerged in Syria and Iraq, and it's basically an internal conflict about sorting out religious issues. And there are a lot of caveats because I know it's a very sensitive topic, and I'll get to those caveats in a moment. But let me just begin with the Arab Uprisings. As you know, in 2011, people began to rebel in the Arab world for various reasons, for economic reasons, because there are employment problems, there are economic problems, because there's no real democratic governance in a lot of these countries. And the chant that led these uprisings in many countries, from Egypt to Bahrain to Tunisia, was the people want to overthrow the system. And the system in Arabic is the word nizam, and it has a very powerful meaning. So the people want to overthrow the system, and that's what they shouted in streets all over the Middle East. But as we saw, as these uprisings took different turns, in some countries people were overthrown, in some countries there were multiple uprisings, such as Egypt, there were other developments that evolved from this initial goal to change political systems and to change economic systems. And one result of this was that we saw that religious identity became more prominent. It's always been prominent in Arab societies, but it became more prominent than people had imagined when the uprisings began. And a core part of the uprising became this debate over who is a true believer. So, and what constitutes this believer? What does the believer, what kind of Islam should this person practice? In what form? And who is the judge of this? So, in countries such as Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, and if you remember, in Syria in particular, there was quite a unanimous feeling within the population that they'd had enough of the oppression of the Assad regime. And so there in particular, the objective was to overthrow the government, but as you can see, it's evolved in different directions. And so the one result of these uprisings was, whose Islam is it? So is it the Islam of Shia Muslims? Is it the Islam of Sunni Muslims? ISIS claims that it's their Islam, but they instrumentalize religion, and that should be a very clear point. ISIS is not Islamic. They use religion for their own violent and political purposes. And so this is why today I decided to just try to share with you some of the distinctions within Muslim communities and their differences in belief and why this has become such a powerful mobilizing factor in Arab societies. So I'll begin with just showing you a few slides, general slides. This is a slide, if you want to look at the screen, of the breakdown between Shia and Sunni Muslims, and I'll get to the definition in just one moment. But as you can see, overwhelmingly, much of the world is Sunni, and that's true for the Arab world as well, even though in some countries the Sunnis are the minority. So this is some of the demographics, and you can see I've just chosen some of the countries to show you the breakdown. So in Lebanon, the statistics in Lebanon, for example, and this is one, my first caveat is that these statistics probably are not very precise because it's very much a politicized issue of what the percentages are between Shia and Sunni Muslims. So in the case of Lebanon, for example, there has not been a consensus in many decades because nobody wants to know the numbers. Nobody even wants to know the numbers of Christians because they're so few. And this alters the political balance in these countries. But as you can see, in Lebanon, there are 45% Sunni Muslims. In Iraq, you can go down the list. In Syria, the Sunnis far outweigh the Alawites, which of course is the Assad family, even though they have ruled the country for many decades. In Bahrain, you see the statistics. The Sunnis are the minority, even though they rule the country. In Saudi Arabia, the Sunnis are the majority. In Kuwait, the Sunnis are the majority. So why is there a conflict? How did this conflict develop? And I think that that's, as I said, it's very complicated. Even people in the US government don't understand the differences. But I will try to just give you some basic facts. So, as the slide indicates, the Prophet Mohammed died in 632, and there was a dispute over his succession. So should his successor be a companion, and we call the companions of the Prophet, or should his successor be someone of his bloodline, his cousin Ali? Well, Ali became the successor. There were opposing camps on this, so this is where the conflict began, who his successor should be. And after some time, Ali became the successor, and it ended in a battle. Okay, so it ended in this battle that created the split between Shia and Sunni Islam in the assassination of Hussein, who was Ali's son. And this battle, which we call the Battle of Karbala, has really defined sort of the Shia narrative, if you can believe it, ever since then. So for centuries, the battle of the assassination of Hussein has become very much a part of Shia identity, so much that every year they commemorate his death, and they mourn for days to commemorate his death. So just a few more definitions. Most Shia today are 12er Shias. So these are the Shia in Iran. What is interesting about how the Syria war has developed is that, as you know, Iran and Hezbollah, which is a Shia militia group in Lebanon, have come to aid Assad. And they've sent their militaries there, and along with the Russians, they've helped Assad remain in power. However, in the Shia tradition, the Alawites were often considered a heterodox sect. They weren't considered Shia Muslims. And it was not until the father Assad, when he was president, had a cleric issue a religious decree declaring the Alawites as Shia Muslims that they became sort of considered to be Shia Muslims. And he did this for political reasons, because he didn't want the Alawites to be outcasts. He wanted them to be part of the Shia community. Now, 3 million, there are 3 million people who live in Syria, Lebanon, and Turkey, and they are what we call Alawites. So the question that's often asked is, if this conflict has existed so many years in history, why is it so intensified now in the Arab world? What has happened? And I'll give you a few reasons that I believe that the conflict, and it's been well established, has taken on such a violent turn. For one thing, the United States invasion of Iraq, and I know this is a very controversial statement that I'm about to say, but the United States invasion of Iraq led to the spread of the Shia-Sunni conflict in other countries post-Arab uprisings. Now, how did this happen? Because when the United States invaded Iraq, of course, they toppled Saddam Hussein, who was a Sunni leader, who had oppressed and marginalized his Shia population for many decades, brutalized them, and a Shia-led government was put in place with the approval of the United States. Today, a second Shia-led government is in power in Iraq. And this tipped, of course, the balance of power that had existed not only in Iraq, but it tipped the balance of power as it was perceived within these two communities in the Middle East, so that the Shia began, suddenly they were ascending. And even in 2006, it was King Abdullah of Jordan who famously, in the Washington Post, coined this term of the Shia crescent. And perhaps you have read this, but already in 2006, after the invasion, it was noted in the Arab world that the Shia were ascending because of the shift in the power structure in Iraq, and they were ascending in other countries as well. They felt very empowered by the fact that there was a Shia-led government in Iraq. So that's the first reason. The second reason is that once the Arab uprisings happened, so there were a few things happening at once the Arab uprisings happened. First of all, you had the invasion of Iraq, as I mentioned, this changing dynamics within Iraq between Shia and Sunni and who controlled the country. And you also had, by the time the Arab uprisings had occurred, you had, in many countries such as Egypt, you already had the presence and the very dominant role of Islamist parties, moderate, nonviolent Islamist parties that had been participating in politics and that had really Islamized the societies. And so once the Arab uprisings happened, as you remember, in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood was very poised to run in elections and win the presidency because they had acquired so much power in the country that once there were elections, they ran and they won. And this also demonstrated, again, my point that religion matters. And I just want to share one small anecdote, especially when we're talking about Egypt. Even though I have written books and most of my career has been documenting the important role of Egyptian society, many people in the Arab world like to downplay this, not only in the West, but in terms of, whether Islam is a factor in sort of the changes in the Middle East, but also in societies people downplay this because they don't, It's considered sort of taboo in some way. If you say that it's politics driving the conflict, somehow that's much more digestible than saying it's religious difference that drives the conflict. So this has always been the case, and I'm going to show you a poll in a few moments to demonstrate this. But it's so much the case that in the late 1990s, and I was just mentioning to one of our guests here who's from Cairo that I spent 5 years in Cairo in the late 1990s, and I was researching a book on the Muslim Brotherhood, and I spent years interviewing them. And it was at a time when it was very clear that Egypt was becoming a more religious society. And so I went to interview the education minister because even young school children were wearing headscarves. And there was a big debate over, just the same as in this country, should there be religious expression in state schools? So should this be permitted? Because the schoolgirls were wearing hijabs, as we call in Arabic, the veil, the headscarf, in elementary schools. So I went to interview the education minister. He says, no, your research is completely on the wrong track. Egypt is becoming a more secular society, not a more Islamic society, and the only reason that all of these women and girls are wearing headscarves is that they can't afford to buy shampoo. So, and he expected me to believe this. So I think that's it's and this was in the 90s. So you can see that in many countries, it was very important. The emergence of Islamist, moderate, nonviolent political parties and movements were already on the rise way before the Arab uprisings, which also contributed to religion becoming very important. Another reason is that at the same time that these Islamist movements were being created outside the state, okay, because obviously the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, it was in opposition to the state. It never was part of the state until they won in free elections. So there were two things going on in parallel. There was the Islamization of societies, and there was also the delegitimization of state-sponsored religion. So in every country, the way that many countries, such as Egypt, Saudi Arabia does it as well, tried to control the religious message through all these years was that they would appoint clerics, and they would license them, and the clerics would have to approve their sermons in the mosques. They're considered state religion, so they're approved by the state. So as this conflict began to develop between the religion that was not state-sponsored and the religion that was state-sponsored, that's when there began to be a shift in what I call the democratization of religion. So religion became a free-for-all. You can take a text of the Quran, you can interpret it any way you want. I did a whole focus group in an area of Egypt called Mbaba, an area of Cairo, where the local sheikh, who was completely uneducated, he was called sheikh, and people listened to him. He would make all sorts of religious pronouncements. So the third thing that was happening at the time of the Arab uprisings was that the state-sanctioned religion was becoming less respected by people. And this meant, of course, this opened the door for others to interpret religion. So that was another factor. And the third factor, and the final one that I'll mention, is that that as the conflict has grown, it's become a fight for survival. So the Shia believe that their religious tradition is in jeopardy of extinction, and the Sunnis believe the same. And this is why the conflict has become so intensified, because it's not just a matter of who is a true Muslim. It's a matter of what tradition will survive after all of these conflicts and wars end, if they ever will. I just want to mention a few, before I get on to the next topic, I just want to mention a few modern manifestations of this conflict that date back before the Arab uprisings. So just to give you sort of the continuum of how this developed long before the Arab uprisings, as I mentioned, from the 70s into the 90s and then to the Arab uprisings. So the first point is there was, if you look on your screen, there was a conflict over interpretation of Islam, which I've explained to you, that's happened over a long period of time. The Iranian Revolution in 1979 And as was mentioned, I was a correspondent in Iran for 3 years, fascinating years. It was really, really intellectually very stimulating. Iran is a very sophisticated society. People there are extremely intelligent. The Iranian Revolution was one of those turning points, just like the invasion of Iraq, that tipped the balance. So suddenly the Shia were on the rise, as King Abdullah said, the Shia crescent. They were on the rise, and they created an Islamic state. Who would have ever thought that an Islamic state could be created in the modern world? But as you know, Khomeini led the revolution, and they created an Islamic state. The Lebanon Civil War, which went on between 1979 and 1990, was also one of these turning points before the Arab uprisings that intensified the conflict to some degree. Now, this was a civil war that was between many religious communities, including my own families who are Maronites, were Christians. But it involved many sects in Lebanon. It was a very bloody, bloody war that ended with what we call a confessional political system. So the way the Lebanese resolved this conflict among sects is they said, okay, we're going to have a government, and every time there's an election, the prime minister has to be a Sunni, and the president has to be a Christian. So they used the political system to try to allocate power and authority to each sect. And that's how the Lebanese have dealt with this question, which has been successful sometimes, unsuccessful in others. The Lebanon now has been without a president for 2 years because they can't agree on who the president should be. So I already mentioned Iraq, that there was Saddam Hussein, the Sunni leader. In Syria, I mentioned that the Alawite minority for decades has controlled a Sunni majority. In Bahrain, now Bahrain is a very interesting example because, as I mentioned, and I made many trips to Bahrain since the uprising began, but the Shia started the uprising with Sunni cooperation because they wanted not even a democratic form of governance. They were advocating a constitutional monarchy because the government has been controlled by a dynasty, a ruling family, for many, many years. And it unfortunately unraveled into what became labeled as a Shia-led uprising. The Sunnis backed out, in part because of a lot of government propaganda, because the Sunni government convinced the society that this was an Iranian-backed uprising, that they should not support it. And now the society, unfortunately, is very polarized. So if you go to cafes in Bahrain, for example, the Shia sit in one cafe, the Sunnis sit in another. I just saw some Bahrainis who are visiting in Washington, and they said that they can't even go to restaurants anymore. They're Shia. They can't even go into restaurants which are considered to be Sunni restaurants. So it's almost, to some degree, as African Americans were treated in the United States before there was a civil rights movement. I mean, that's how bad it's become to some degree. As I mentioned, in Saudi Arabia, the Sunni majority has a Shia minority. So I mentioned that the importance of religion because, as I explained, it has a historical meaning. It's been developing for a long time, even before the Arab uprisings. But I want to offer a few caveats. One is that that when you hear about groups like ISIS, for example, this is just some more information. You can read it about sort of building on the points that I mentioned regarding employment and institutional marginalization. But it's important, despite everything I've said, not to associate religion with ISIS or other extremist groups, even Al-Qaeda, because although there is this contest to try to define Islam and to reinterpret Islam, and as one Salafist told me, whose Salafists are Islamists who want to practice the faith as it existed in the time of the Prophet so many years ago. But as one Salafist told me, right after the uprising in Egypt, he said, we want to redefine how Islam is practiced. And so even though I've given you a few minutes of explanation on the importance of religion, it's important to understand that ISIS, Al-Qaeda, some other groups that you read about and hear about on the news, they are using religion. They use religion to carry out their very violent tendencies. And it happens on the Shia side as well. One of the chapters in my book is about Shia militias in Iraq. So another example of the sectarianism that I'm talking about is that during the invasion, Shia militias developed in Iraq. These are armed militias that were trying to combat the Sunnis. And in 2000, when ISIS invaded Iraq and took over the city of Mosul, which I'm sure you've heard about, a very prominent, because of this, as I mentioned, this fear of survival, this existential threat that both sides fear, because ISIS, a Sunni group, had actually taken territory in Mosul. One of the prominent clerics, the most prominent cleric in Iraq, Ayatollah Sistani, who worked very closely with the Americans after the invasion, he issued a fatwa, which we call in Arabic, it's a religious decree, calling upon Shia to take up arms. He said, no matter who you are, whether you're Shia, he called for Sunnis and Shia, but only the Shia, for the most part, responded. He said, we need to take up arms against ISIS because this is not Islamic, and we don't want these people taking our territory. But what has happened again, because of all the conditions that I explained, is that it's become a very sectarian militia force. There are many, I shouldn't generalize, there are many Shia militias that have developed as a result of this fatwa, but for the most part, they're very anti-Sunni. So their mission, their stated mission, is to go into towns once ISIS has left and try to fight ISIS, and to return the towns to the Sunnis who lived there, not ISIS. But what has happened is in some towns, and Tikrit is an example of this, is that the Sunni populations are never able to return. So they've become a very sectarian militia. So again, what began as a moderate cleric issuing a religious decree to try to stem off the tide of a very militant group, unfortunately, has deteriorated into a very sectarian kind of performance by these Shia militias. So the last thing I just want to mention to you, because I speak about this topic, but I always, when people explain complicated ideas to me, I always want to know, well, what does this look like in real terms? And so I want to just show you two Salafists. These are people driving this sectarianism. So if it's not only happening on the ground in the form of conflict, it's happening as a form of discussion, it's happening as a form of debate. The Sunnis say that the Shia are not real Muslims. The Shia at some point respond. And a lot of this, among normal people, this conversation is going on online. So as part of my book and part of my research for the Brookings Institution, I conducted a study of Twitter feeds in Arabic and social media that were from 2012 to 2016, Twitter feeds that were tweeted by the most powerful Salafists. Again, these are Islamists who are very conservative, and they're very anti-Shia, to try to get a sense of the language. Like, what are they saying? Are they talking about politics? Are they talking about religion? And why are they so convincing? Because in the case of these two people I'll show you, this man, Adnan Ahmed, so he lives in Saudi Arabia. And he has right now about 2 million Twitter followers, which is not that many, believe it or not. I'm going to show you somebody else who has 14 million. But he has 2 million Twitter followers, and he's actually a very educated man. So we also get this false impression that a lot of these people are very uneducated and they're just sort of crazy and they don't understand what they're saying, and that's absolutely not the case. He has a PhD. He was actually born in Syria, and he became very powerful as a result of the Syrian uprising because that became his narrative. His narrative was that we have to defeat the Shia because Assad has killed hundreds of thousands of people, of Sunnis. And he uses very, very polarizing language. He said, for example, I'm glad you already ate your lunch, but he said, for example, that he once publicly vowed to grind the flesh of the Alawites. So they use very graphic language to drive this hatred and animosity toward the Shia. And I'm just going to show you briefly, you can see where some of his followers are. So as part of the study, I also examined, well, where are all of these followers who are tweeting and retweeting with him all day long? And you can see that they come from all over the world, really, even the United States. Mostly in Saudi Arabia, because that's where he lives. And the other very important statistic is that a lot of these people, like the Salafists I'm mentioning, who are driving this animosity, their constituents are young people. So at the same time that youth are very instrumental in improving Arab societies, there are also youth that are radicalized. And these are not radical sheikhs, they're not violent, but they have the potential to radicalize young people. And as you can see from this statistic, most of his followers are between the ages of 18 and 34. So the last Salafist I want to mention is this man, Mohammed Rafi. Now he has 14 million Twitter followers to date. And he is a professor at King Saud University in Riyadh. He's also an imam at a state-sanctioned academy. He was a preacher in the Saudi Navy. So again, these are not people who are just, rogue figures. I mean, they're sanctioned by the state. And he, again, profited from the Syrian war and the Syrian uprising and became very anti-Shia. He said that, for example, that, the Shia torture people, and they would even boil a child in water. And they use this kind of terminology. He said Shiism as heresy, it did not exist at the time of the Prophet. So again, you can see he uses political references, but he also uses religious references because he's talking about the fact that Shia Islam, as I explained to you, did not exist in the time of the Prophet. It happened later after the split. So I was told to stop promptly at 1 o'clock. So I know we're on a tight schedule. So I hope that I've given you some idea of the role of religion in Arab societies and why it's important. It's certainly not the only factor. There are other factors, there are political factors, there are territorial factors, but I think that it's the one part of this story that you don't really hear about in the media in terms of why religion matters. You hear about how it's instrumentalized by extremist groups such as ISIS, but I think that there is not enough information about why it matters and why it matters in terms of Arab identity. So in a sense, for many people in the Arab world, what's happened since the Arab uprisings is that people are not, their identities, some people, and I want to qualify this, don't consider themselves Bahrainis. They don't consider themselves Lebanese. They don't consider themselves Egyptians. They are Sunni Muslims or they're Shia Muslims. And in that sense, the national identity and how people define themselves has changed. And that change is very much responsible for the tension in some countries and all-out war and conflict in others. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions. Yes, sir.
So could you talk?
Oh, I was also asked to please speak loudly because there are no microphones.
So could you talk a little bit about the history of?
Thank you. So the gentleman is asking how Islam was interpreted over time and if there's a hierarchy. And that's a really important question, not only in how it describes Islamic interpretation, but the differences between Shia and Sunni, because I'll answer the hierarchy part of it first. Remember, I mentioned that religion has been democratized. That's a good thing and a bad thing. The good thing is that you don't have to rely on state-sanctioned propaganda anymore. You can talk to other people, other sheikhs, and I'm simplifying it. But to understand how you should practice your faith. The downside, of course, is that it's a free-for-all. Now, what's different about Sunni and Shia Islam is in Iran, for example, when I was there, I visited so many seminaries, and in order to be what we call a Hojjatul Islam, which is the second rank beneath Ayatollah, it's very difficult to reach the level of Ayatollah. You have to study something like 15 years in a Shia seminary in Iran. It's a very, very rigorous educational system. And you have to study, you have to pass exams, you have to go before boards, it's a very, very rigorous system. And the Iranian clerics are very, very sophisticated. And I spent much time with them when I was in Iran, traveling to the city of Qom, which is the Shia center. So much so that the government banned me from going there, because the secret the Iranians never want people to know is that the clerics don't agree with the regime. So the clerics don't believe that clerics should run a state, which is exactly what happens in Iran. It's against the Shia tradition. It's a new phenomenon that emerged from the 1979 revolution, and they don't believe a cleric should run a state. And I have to share this one anecdote just briefly with you, but the clerics are so sophisticated that I would go to see them because I was so fascinated by all their explanations of religion and their seminaries. And I even interviewed one very, very famous Ayatollah by the name of Montazeri, who was under house arrest at the time. And so I became somewhat known as the girl who goes to interview the clerics. And once I went to interview a very prominent cleric, and at the end of the interview, he asked me, it's sort of condescending in a way, but he said, "How does a little woman like you ask such big questions?" And so, but that to me was, and they're very serious. But my point to you is that that's the Shia tradition. In the Sunni tradition, it's much more, it's much freer. So, as I mentioned to you, especially since the 1970s, there are self-appointed sheikhs. A neighborhood can say you're a sheikh. You can interpret religion in a storefront mosque. There are many storefront mosques in Egypt, or there used to be under Mubarak. Now the government has tried to crack down. So there is something called Al-Azhar, which is a university and mosque complex that was considered the sort of theological and intellectual center for Sunni Islam. It's not so much anymore, but that's where people were educated. But the system of education is not as rigorous. So there's much more of a hierarchy in Shia Islam than there is in Sunni Islam. How Islam has been interpreted, would take me a long time to answer. It's gone through many periods, and I want to also mention that there have been Islamic reformers. So as part of this search for interpretation, there have been many reformers. One of them was Mohammed Abdo. He's very famous. There have always been reformers trying to reconcile this. It's not a necessary conflict, but it's become a conflict between how to practice the faith in modern times and how it was practiced before. And so throughout Islamic history, there have been reformers, and they've played very important roles in how Islam is interpreted. Yes, sir.
Is there any reason to think that the Alawites are putting some distance between themselves and Assad?
So the question is there any reason to believe Alawites are putting distance between themselves and Assad? Absolutely. We all get the impression that all Alawites support Assad, and that's not true. And similarly, many Sunnis support Assad, especially in the business community. In cities such as Aleppo and other places, there's a lot of Sunni support for Assad. I think, though, that what is, and I was just moderating a conference in Washington, actually, when there was a former Syrian diplomat who was speaking to us from Geneva, and he was at the Geneva talks. And the way that he explained it is you have to distinguish between people who defect from the regime and people who just sort of don't agree with Assad. Because if you look just at the defections, there haven't been that many. And that's why people get the impression that all the Alawites support Assad. But what he was explaining, and he's a member of the opposition, so you have to take what he says with somewhat of a grain of salt. But what he was explaining was that there are a lot of Alawites who don't support Assad. But if you want to stay in Syria, you better be quiet. Yes, ma'am.
It seems with the rise of Salafists that women's rights in the Middle East are increasingly challenged. Do you see any points of light for the future?
Thank you. A very important question. So the question is, are women's rights jeopardized by ISIS and everything that's happening? As I mentioned, what ISIS is doing is very un-Islamic. And if you look at the way they sell sex slaves and all these disgusting things that they do to women, at the same time that this is happening, as a result of the Arab uprisings, women became very empowered. And I will use Egypt again as the example, because I've spent so many years living there. There were always civil society groups run by women in Egypt. But the women participated very actively in the uprising. They were in Tahrir Square, they were marching, they were demonstrating against Mubarak initially, and women became very empowered in Egypt as a result of the uprising. And they suffered because of it. There has been a lot of sexual harassment against Egyptian women by Egyptian men since the uprisings. There's an increase in rape. The years that I lived there, I would walk in the streets at 1 or 2 in the morning and never think anything of it. Now when foreigners go there, they're very cautious, they're very careful, because the sort of violations against women have significantly increased. So to answer your question, yes, women have been humiliated. There's been a lot of violence committed against women, but that's also to some degree a result of the fact that they've become a lot more empowered since the Arab uprisings began. Yes?
What are some of the manifestations of this tension between the Shia?
A really great question. Are there any manifestations in America among Shia and Sunni? So most Shia live in Detroit, in the Detroit and Dearborn area. And when I researched my book on Muslims in America, I spent a lot of time in these communities, really nice people, and even in one mosque, the Shia and the Sunni prayed together. They went to, they belonged to the same mosque. I haven't been there since 2007, but I've been told by many people in the Islamic community, and perhaps our friends in the audience could weigh in on this later, that there is now strife among the Shia and the Sunni living in the Dearborn and the Detroit areas as a result of what's happening globally. And so that's just something that's been told to me secondhand. I haven't really witnessed it myself, but it seems to make sense. They are having a lot of conferences, though, I'm told, to have dialogue, to have reconciliation, but that sort of, unfortunately, I think that some of what's happening globally has affected this community in the Dearborn area. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
The media equates minorities being a small.
Well, if you're speaking about the Middle East, I don't think I'm qualified to answer the global issue, but if you're talking about the Middle East, I think that this is why this problem, and the reason I write about it and talk about it, is, I think, intractable for the foreseeable future. Because how do you answer these questions? They're philosophical. And so, because there is no real answer and anyone can lay claim to what is religion and what isn't, unfortunately, I think that as a result of all the factors I explained, not only since the Arab uprisings, but beginning at least in the 70s, I think this problem will be with the Middle East for a long time. I can say that there are reconciliation efforts going on. Even the United States is very much involved in reconciliation efforts in Iraq, for example. There's a new office, which is only a year old, within the State Department, an Office of Religious Affairs. This is not the proper title, but that's the idea. And they're doing a lot of work in Iraq to try to bring together the Shia and the Sunni and have some sort of reconciliation effort. But I think that these are very, minor ripples in the pond. I hate to say it, but as I warned Mary, my speech is not going to be too upbeat. But in any case, so I think that unfortunately, it will be with us for some time. Yes, sir.
How much of the problem is attributable to the way the borders were laid out after World War II?
Great question. So the gentleman is asking how much of this is attributable to what we call the Sykes-Picot agreement that was signed in 1916 among colonial powers that basically artificially divided up the Middle East. In my view, very much a result of that. And everything that happened since then. So the other reason that I talk about this subject is that it's redrawing the borders of the Middle East. If you look at Syria, Syria is now a partitioned country. Iraq, to some degree, is a partitioned country. So we're hoping Lebanon won't become a partitioned country, and I don't really think so. But I hesitate to some degree to sort of subscribe to this analysis, because this is the analysis ISIS uses. Okay, ISIS says that this is all about Sykes-Picot. We're getting revenge on the colonialists because they discriminated against us and they redrew our countries and they created artificial countries. Iraq is not supposed to be the country it is. And what ISIS is doing actually is trying to redraw the borders. This is what they have very strategically mapped out, how they can have corridors between Iraq and Syria. However, if you look at it completely from a political point of view, and I think that this also, to some degree, was one of the many reasons for the rise of Islamism in the Arab world, because you had, as a result of this artificial configuration, this artificial structuring of Arab states, you had outside powers determining the nation state, so-called, okay? The nation state was going to look like this, it was going to have these borders, and it was going to be ruled by secular dictators. And colonial powers supported these secular dictators for decades. I mean, that was US policy in the Middle East. Support the dictators, because the alternative, especially beginning in the 1970s with the rise of Islamism, the alternative is worse. Whereas I always argued that if you had just allowed Islamist parties to be included in the political process, a lot of this could have been avoided. So in my own view, it was everyone in this country was so surprised there was a revolution in Egypt, and I always asked, why didn't it come sooner? I mean, when I was living there in the 1990s, there should have been a revolution in the 1990s, because it was all about Mubarak, it was all about secular parties, it was clear the society has transformed, as I mentioned. The Muslim Brotherhood should not have been banned. The Muslim Brotherhood, which was a nonviolent organization, it had renounced violence for decades before, it should have been allowed in the political process. And I think that if that had happened, if even Salafist groups had been allowed, if there was more inclusivity in the political process, you wouldn't have had this enormous backlash. And so that's a long way of answering your question, but I think it stems from colonial rule in many of these countries. And what we've seen, as I was mentioning to someone, since the Arab Uprisings, is that this is about self-determination. And there's much less of a role, now that we're speaking on this day in a political season, I think there's much less role for the United States in the Middle East now. And that's, in my mind, that's a good thing. I think the United States should get out of the business of the Middle East. They don't understand the Middle East. Nobody wants them there anymore. Everywhere they've gone, from Iraq to Syria, has not been all that successful. So I think that there needs to be a re-examination of the United States' role in the Middle East. And that's what a lot of people, serious people, not me, are doing in Washington these days, is trying to figure this out. What will the next administration do in the Middle East? But particularly because even if you look at the Obama policy, it hasn't really worked out all that well. I mean, first there was trying to resolve the Palestinian-Israeli crisis. There was not much movement there. Then it was withdrawing from Iraq. That didn't work out so well, because look at the result. Then there was the decision not to intervene in Syria. I'm not going to say whether that was good or bad, but I think that some people would have argued that the United States should have intervened. So it's a large question of Western involvement. I was told to stop at 1:13, so I've gone over my time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
an MCM production.